everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Rock Daydream Nation, and I've got back to the channel our friend Reed Little. How are you, my friend?
Doing great, Peter. Thank you for inviting me, as always.
Absolutely. Today we are going to do a ranking show, ranking the top 10 Black Sabbath albums. Little surprised we haven't done this topic previously, Reed, but I think it's timely and really looking forward to having this discussion. So it's plain and simple. We just pick 10 Sabbath albums in order from 10 to 1. I will throw it over to you, Reed. What's your number 10 pick?
Okay. Now, I just want to say, in general, I am a huge Black Sabbath fan. Black Sabbath are quite literally the band that made me a heavy metal fan. I used to just listen to music, and then once I heard a particular song, which we'll be talking about much later in the show, I became a heavy metal fan for life. So Sabbath is deeply a part of my life. Their music makes me happier than any other band, which is maybe weird for a doom band, or the band that arguably invented heavy metal and doom metal. But they have a huge, diverse catalog, and I'm going to say in advance, people may or may not agree with my picks, which is fine because people, you are different people. Feel free to love all of the Black Sabbath albums in whatever order you want. This is my personal list. So if I leave your favorite album off, it's still there and you still love it. So I am going to start with The Eternal Idol at number 10. I do not have props to hold up. I only own this one in an electronic format right now. So I really view The Eternal Idol as, there you go. Tony, it's really his first attempt to kind of modernize the Black Sabbath sound. So the songs are a little more up-tempo. Now, he's the only original member of Black Sabbath in the band at this point. It's him and a bunch of studio musicians. He's got Bob Daisley on bass. He's got Eric Singer on drums. Oh, I'm sorry. Also Jeff Johns, although Jeff was not recognized as an official Black Sabbath member yet. He had been on the albums, remember when he started Sabotage? Maybe Never Say Die? He had been around the band for a long time, but was not acknowledged as an official member. But what they come out with is a cracking album. It's got fantastic riffs. It's got Bob Daisley writing lyrics. So the lyrics are, they're different than what you would get from Dio or Geezer Butler, but they're good lyrics. And I think Tony Martin sounds amazing. Now, I've never heard the version that Ray Gillen sings on, so I can't compare it. But I like the Tony Martin years, but this is my favorite of the albums he sings on, and it's probably because Tony didn't write the lyrics himself. I think he's a better vocalist than he is lyricist. So you've got a much more modern sounding production. You've got up-tempo songs, amazing riffs. Tony is soloing his butt off. It's just a solid album, but it's still only my number 10.
Well, okay, thank you. That's a great start to the show. My number 10 is, it was originally going to be put out as a Tony Iommi solo album, and I'm talking about the 7-Star. So Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi. There he is by himself. The thing I like about this album is Glenn Hughes sings his ass off. And it's quite amazing that this album, the performances are really spick because, Iommi and Hughes were going through a bit of a heavy coke phase. Glenn Hughes was right in the midst of addiction. His output in the 80s was, very sparse, basically because of drug problems that he was having. But getting back to this album, I think it's a cracking album. It's played really well. You've got a fantastic band behind it. It's starting off with In for the Kill. It's got that sort of galloping Iron Maiden sound, and Tony Iommi's playing with a lot of fierceness. But there's even some slower balladry in regards to it. In memory, No Stranger to Love was the single that was pushed and got a little bit of MTV. Very strange film clip, putting Tony Iommi in a semi-romantic type of storyline was a little bit odd, to say the least, but it's kind of moving. I would call this the Black Sabbath hair metal album, and I don't mind it at all. I think it's melodic. It's still got a lot of rock crunch, but Glenn Hughes, despite all the trappings of his whatever he was going through, he sings his ass off. I think it's a cracker of an album. So that's my number 10, Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi. A lot of naysayers, Reed, will probably say, well, it's probably a Tony Iommi solo album, but it's got the title Black Sabbath, and I'll include it in my top 10. So that's my first pick.
All right, very good. Well, I'm going to piggyback on that because Seventh Star is my number 9. A fantastic album, again, arguably a Tony Iommi solo album, but it is labeled Black Sabbath, so it counts. I am a huge fan of Glenn Hughes and Tony Iommi. The combination of those two is magical. I arguably like the 1996 DEP sessions better, but Seventh Star is still a wonderful album. Glenn Hughes adds a soulfulness that you don't get in other Black Sabbath music, which shows a little bit more of Tony Iommi's range as an arranger and player. I don't think it has Tony's best riffs, but he really stretches out as a soloist. And interestingly, my favorite song on the album is a song called Angry Heart, which doesn't even have a guitar solo. It's really more of a Glenn Hughes song. He's talking about life and not letting life pass you by. He had a lot of emotional problems to go along with his drug abuse. But it's a fantastic song and a wonderful album, and I have no problems putting it at number 9.
Okay. Well, thank you, Reed, for that. Well, I'm actually going to go piggyback off you with your number 10 and talk about The Eternal Idol. This has gone way up in my ranking over a period of time. I love it. There's a lot of gothic subject matter. I love Tony Martin's vocals, very operatic, very expressive. The whole band is just firing on all cylinders. So you've got the bottom end of Bob Daisley, whip smart lyrics, Eric Singer right in the pocket, and Tony Iommi, he's just pulling out these monstrous riffs. It's very underrated in the discography, and it was in a period where Black Sabbath were kind of commercially in the doldrums. In the Tony Martin years, they were playing really small theatres. They weren't the arena act. It's a little bit, bit of a head scratch because this band should have been playing arenas and, playing those big, like 10 to 20,000 seaters stadiums, because this is the sort of sound, it's so powerful, needs to be heard in those sort of venues. Yeah, look, I've heard the Ray Gillen version. Reed, I like it. It's very expressive. It's very operatic. So I don't see much of a change between Ray Gillen's version of it and Tony Martin, other than Bob Daisley was writing the lyrics with Ray Gillen in mind. Bob had a bit of a friendship with Ray. So it's always when you have a change of personnel and you've got somebody being drafted into a band and singing for lyrics that weren't written for you, sometimes it can be a little bit of a shift that can be a little bit jarring. But to me, I don't mind the Tony Martin. This album's got some cracking songs. I really love The Shining. I think that is just such a great opening track. And Black Sabbath have a habit of just putting cracker of opening tracks on all their albums. I love The Ancient Warrior, Born to Lose, Nightmare. They're all great songs. They're going more into the gothic sort of themes and topics that Black Sabbath are renowned for. And that makes it a bit of a difference from the last album, which was more about matters of the heart and a little bit outside the Black Sabbath wheelhouse. Anyway, that's my number 9. The Eternal Idol, and it's incredibly underrated, Reed.
It is. It definitely deserves another look if people haven't listened to it recently.
All right, you're number 8.
So this may surprise you that I'm putting it so low, but my number 8 is Dehumanizer. So Sabbath was obviously in a very weird state of mind. They had done several albums now with Tony Martin. At least two. I always forget when Tear came out, if Tear came out before or after Dehumanizer. But they had done at least Eternal Idol and Headless Cross with Tony Martin. And then Geezer Butler had hooked up with Dio. And mind you, Geezer was not in Sabbath at this time, but Geezer had done a couple of guest appearances with Dio, and the two had gotten along well. And apparently, they contacted Tony and said, "Hey, let's get the old band back together." So they got Sabbath Mark II or Mark III, whatever you want to think of it, and put out Dehumanizer. And I love it. I love the songs. I love the energy on it. They didn't miss a beat. It's just like you would absolutely, if this had been the next album to come out after Mob Rules, it would have fit in perfectly. Dio is hitting all of his themes. It's got really awesome guitars on it. But I'm putting it this low because I don't like the sound of the album. It's one of those albums that the production of it's very harsh on my ears. And I get fatigued listening to it. So I can listen to two or three songs. My favorite song on it is Letters from Earth, but there are some cracking songs on it. But after a while, it's abrasive and harsh. And I'm like, I love this music, but I wish they would remaster it and maybe make it a little less hard on my ears.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I've heard there's a lot of controversy in the mix of that album. I've heard a lot of YouTube commentators do refer to the mix of the album being a little bit sharp. So I don't think what you're saying is too untoward in respect to a lot of the public opinion. Have you heard the remix of the album or the remastered version, Ree? Just out of interest?
I have not. I'm not a major collector, and it bugs me to pay twice for something I already own. So unless I know that it's a vast improvement, I just, stick with my original purchase.
Yeah. Would you agree it's probably the heaviest or one of the heaviest Black Sabbath albums?
Well, I think that's true of all the Dio albums. They're just heavy, heavy album. Well, excuse me, not Heaven and Hell. I actually think Heaven and Hell is not nearly as heavy
Yeah.
as
But
Mob Rules or
but in the
Dehumanizer.
scheme of the discography, there's a lot of commentary that this is probably right up there as the heaviest Black Sabbath album. Would you
Oh,
agree with that?
I do. It's brutal, and I love that it's completely out of step with the music at the time. There was no popular music that sounded like this when it came out, and I love that. It's Black Sabbath sticking to their guns and doing what they did best.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Well, this is my first controversial take in the top 10 to public opinion, and I'm going to choose the self-titled debut from 1970 of Black Sabbath. I mean, this top 10 is my favorites, and it's an album that I don't go regularly to. To a lot of pundits, it single-handedly created the sound of heavy metal. I know I can appreciate the historical importance of this album, but it's not an album in the discography that I go to a hell of a lot. But there are some great songs, like the self-titled Black Sabbath is doomy. It's atmospheric. It's got a lot of drama, and probably single-handedly created a lot of subgenres in the heavy metal genre per se. Other songs that I really, like Evil Woman, The Wizard. It comes into this conversation, Reed, that there is a little bit of blues influence. We won't go down that wheelhouse. I think we've exhausted that argument, pro and con, to death. But you can see that there is a little bit of indexing of the blues, and certain influences are filtered into this particular album. Ozzy's vocals are kind of a little bit more pure, a little bit pure in the sense that they're not as processed, they're quite emotive. And considering you look at the history of this album, that it was recorded within a period of 1 or 2 days, everything's on the fly. it's just amazing that it's quite a quality piece of music. Groundbreaking by sure, but it's ranked where it is in my top 10 simply because it's something that I just don't reference a lot. I mean, I've got a lot of records there that are very worthy, historical, but I don't go back to it a lot. And out of the discography of Black Sabbath, there's just some that I go to a lot more and I have much more of a connection with. But I put it in at number 8 because it's historically important. And arguably, this is where it all began, Reed.
Yeah, that's true. It's a remarkably assured album for their first effort. I think somewhat let down by the cover tune or cover tunes, but probably NIB, my favorite track off of that album. Although, spoiler, I did not include the self-title on my list at all. But we're about to get into the Ozzy years, so really my next 3 picks are functionally interchangeable. I had to put them in an order because this is a ranking list, but which one I would actually put at which position is very much just based on mood. So where I went today is that Volume 4 is my next pick. Volume 4, again, is remarkable just for the fact that it exists. The guys were living in LA. They were completely coked out, sitting around the house doing drugs. As Tony says, they would get absolutely nothing done unless he came up with something for them to do. So they would go to the studio and nothing would happen, and they'd just go home and they'd snort more coke. And yet somehow they produced one of the all-time classic heavy metal albums. It has. I can't believe that at the time they were so drugged out that they thought including FX was actually worth spending some time on the album. But I forgive it because it leads to amazing things once they bring Jeff Johns into the band and they do intros like EV5150, which we'll get into much later. Spoiler. So, Volume 4 has some absolutely fantastic songs. Sabbath is starting to branch out a little bit. They had their proto phase. They had their the first Doom album in Master of Reality. And now that they're producing just a little bit lighter, but still very heavy music, it's very California influenced by that sunshine and coke. And it's, what are we at now? My number 6? My number 7? Now I don't even remember what that was. I think that was 7. My favorite song on it, Supernaut, one of Tony's all-time classics.
Well, that song is just part of the song set, isn't it, for Black Sabbath? It's a classic song. So thank you, Reed. Thank you for that. All right. Well, my next pick, which is number 7, is Mob Rules. So there you have it. With the sparkly production of Martin Birch. I've got 2 versions. This is the original album I got in the day, in the 80s, and then I got the special remastered version of the double LP, and the production is just so sparkly, the separation of the instruments, it just sounds monstrous. Love this album. It's just got some wonderful songs, and there is one of my favorite all-time Black Sabbath songs with Dio is Falling Off the Edge of the World. It's like opera. That was a highlight of Heaven and Hell when I saw him live. The drama, the lighting, Ronnie James Dio. I'm not a big fan of opera, but if opera meets heavy metal, that's the song. I love it. Voodoo, The Mob Rules, The Sign of the Southern Cross, which I think was a very early song that Tony and Dio put together in the day. I don't think there's really a dud track. I even like Country Girl. I've warmed to that. Even the deep cuts are just nice. So I think Dio just sings, with assurance. Vinny Appice's drumming is very sort of in the pocket. It's a different style to Ward because Ward has always been very much more percussive. Vinny Appice is much more a traditional metal drummer, and it fits the material really, really well. Look, I would have liked to have seen them do one more album, but the egos and I guess the coke started to take control, and we didn't get that album in 1984. So anyway, Mob Rules, That's my number 7, Ronnie James Dio. Wonderful, wonderful album.
Okay, we'll be hearing more about that later. All right, so moving on to number 6, I'm going back an album to Master of Reality. So, Master of Reality, again, I consider it the first Doom album. It's so Tony Iommi on this album tuned down. He was in standard tuning on the first album, and Paranoid, but on Master of Reality, he tunes down to C sharp. So a semitone and a half, 1.5 tones, or 1.5 semitones. And it just produces this album that was heavier than anything on the planet at the time. It's got fantastic riffs, and for my money, it's Bill Ward's best drum performance on this album. He just goes nuts on this album. His parts are all over it. It's his most creative drumming. You've still got Geezer delivering amazing lyrics. He's branching out into some different areas. They had taken a lot of flack on their earlier albums for, they were supposedly these Satanists, and so he wrote these songs about Jesus, and it's just got some different feel to it. It still maintains a little bit of that light and shade that Tony always maintained was so important to make a heavy album really heavy, but mostly it's just crushing. My favorite song on it is After Forever, one of the songs that really departs from the previous lyrical formulas.
Well, for you to say that it's got Bill Ward's best drumming performance is saying something, because in that period there is so many great drumming performances. So it's probably you're dealing with fractions here, but well done. You may hear more about that later. All right. Well, my next album pick is actually going the album before Mob Rules, and it's Heaven and Hell. So this really resurrected the Black Sabbath band. Came out in like 1980. So we all know about Never Say Die. That was where Black Sabbath were in the doldrums. Ronnie James Dio comes out of a rainbow, fronts this band. I've lived with this album for a considerable period of time. I love it. It's part of my heavy metal listening fabric of life. Know the lyrics off by heart. It's a very different Black Sabbath, where you've got Geezer's lyrics are much more socio-political, much more observational. Dio was a different type of lyricist, where he was talking about the mystical. And a lot of the interpretation of the lyrics are up to you, where he puts contrasts, like Heaven and Hell. He contrasts night and day, black and white, heaven and hell. So a lot of the answers and the meanings to the lyrics are not conclusive, but they're, you have to work it out for yourself. But that doesn't mean he's a bad lyricist or less lyricist with Geezer Butler. It's completely different. And I think it was probably perfect for the band read that Dio did join them, because, as I said at the start of my little piece, it did give them a lease of life. So many great songs. Where do you start? Neon Nights, which is just a bell ringer of an opening track. Children of the Sea, which I think was another song that they did very much early in the piece in putting together. Lady Evil, Wishing Well, Die Young. Even the deep cuts are wonderful. My only minor quibble is the production with Martin Birch on this album, even on the remastered version, is not as sparkly as Mob Rules. So I find the performances and the songwriting on this album to be stronger than Mob Rules, but the production is not quite as Mob Rules, and I can't work it out why. You got the same producer, 3/4 of the same band. It's a bit of a head scratch. The production is, I wouldn't say the word muffly, but it's not just is crystal clear. And that's always been the biggest quibble. I'd love somebody to go in it and just give it a bit of a remix. Anyway, the performances on this album are fantastic, and not much more to say other than I've lived with this album for quite some time since it came out, and that's my pick.
Okay. You may see that one again a little bit later in the list. All right, let's go to number six, number five. I think number five this time. I really should have put numbers on these things. My number five pick is Sabotage. So, Sabotage, often considered part of a pair with Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. This is really the last of what people usually consider the classic Sabbath albums. Um, it's an album full of raw emotion. They were having serious fights with their management, who allegedly took a lot of money from them, or at least prevented them from seeing a lot of income from their music. It was you can read various people's autobiographies to see how the management situation was going, but that led to angry songs like The Writ and Megalomania that are just raw and dripping with this venom. Um, but despite that, Geezer's lyrics are actually pretty diverse on the album, because he also comes up with these spacey think pieces like "Symptom of the Universe" and "Into the Void." No, not "Into the Void." Sorry, but "Symptom of the Universe." I'm spacing out on what the second one is. So it's not all just anger and hatred. Um, and I think it has Ozzy Osbourne's best vocal performance. I think it's better than any of his solo albums. I think it's better than the preceding Sabbath albums. This is really Ozzy at his peak.
Well, you got no arguments from there, and you'll probably hear about that coming soon. All right, my next pick. I'm obsessed with this album. I love it. And it's an album that was critically reviled in the day, Reed, but over time, it's developed a bit of a cult and a bit of a following of its own. And I'm talking about the Ian Gillan fronted Born Again Black Sabbath. There's so much to unpack here. It has some of the most heaviest, deepest, darkest riffs. It does sound like it was recorded in a dungeon. It's kind of muffly. The story goes that there were some tapes that were sitting on the console that may have baked a little bit, with the heat, and it resulted in the bass and the drums being more muffly. But by accident or not, it's kind of created a bit of a subgenre of music, because I know this album has influenced a lot of bands in the death metal, in a lot of those black metal bands. They go to that album. They go to crushing riffs such as Zero the Hero, which incidentally, hello Slash, you should be paying royalties to Tony Iommi. But Zero the Hero, Reed, I'm not sure if there's any more crushing riffs in their in their song list than that. It's right up there. It's got to be top three of the most crushing riffs. Ian Gillan probably blew a tire out on this album in regards to his vocals. He is screaming. Some of it is just from a whisper to a scream, and some of it is just completely demonic. I've heard testimonies of the tour, incidentally, which was quite successful. A lot of people think this is a flop album and a flop tour, but it did actually quite do well. The tour played big arenas in America. It was successful. Gillan was just giving it his all, and a lot of people, there's some conjecture that he actually blew the voice out on this tour. So initially, Ian Gillan joined the band because it was they all got drunk together. I don't think Bill Ward was at the pub, but it was Geezer, Tony, and Ian. And by the end of it, had a bit of a blinder. He had joined Black Sabbath. I can remember in the day, it was a bit of a, with us metal fans, Reed, to thinking the merging of Deep Purple and Sabbath. Is it Deep Sabbath, or is it, you know what I mean? It was just inconceivable. Critical, they absolutely tarred and brushed this. So many magazines that I read in the day gave this album 1 star, thumbs down, terrible. But over time, people are warming to it and appreciating that out of all of this is actually a cracking rock album. So apparently the tape's going to come out soon. There's going to be a remastering Tony has found the Born Again tapes out under the ashtrays or wherever he's hiding in his mansion. And you know what? I'm not sure if I want to hear it cleaned up because I am so used to the muffly, dark, evil recording of this album that sounds like it's in a dungeon that I don't know if I want to hear the cleaned up version of Born Again. Anyway, I think everyone gets the gist. I really love this album, and that's why I've ranked it that highly. Black Sabbath, Born Again. Do yourself a favor. Check it out.
Okay. I don't want to give any spoilers, but we may be talking about that one a little bit later. All right, so my number 4. Now this one is not a tie with the other 3 Ozzy albums that I've already gone over. This is my favorite. This is a spoiler. This is my favorite of the Ozzy albums. It has been for decades, and that is Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Peter and I did a long-form show talking about this album. I'm not sure what new I can add to it other than to say it's Sabbath's proggiest album. It's very experimental. Geezer's lyrics are all over the map. He's talking about human reproduction and DNA, and it's got, again, these amazing. Well, you can always say Tony's got the riffs, but it has like the riff to Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath is just crushingly heavy. It's got that weird technique where he records 2 different guitar solos, and then they include both of them in the finished track. Although that's not the first time he did that. He also did that on Volume 4 in a couple of songs. But it's a little bit lighter in mood, which is very strange. There's a lot more keyboards, and you get to a song like Sabracadabra, and it's almost a boogie, right? It's Sabbath doing a boogie. So there's a lot of experimentation on the album. I think they really did not want to be pigeonholed as the band that only did these really heavy, doomy songs. So they did stuff that was a little lighter, a little bit faster, and it's a wonderful album. Although it only lasted 1 album, because then you go back to Sabotage and they're right back to those crushingly heavy songs again. But nonetheless, it is my favorite of the Ozzy years. And I think that it is a little bit underrated still. People always talk about the first 4 albums as being the best Sabbath for whatever reason, but I think Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath was the king of the Ozzy years.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Reed. Well, my next pick is Black Sabbath, Masters of Reality. So, a simple album cover, very direct. Only clocks in over a tick over, 32, 33 minutes. Wikipedia, look it up. But it's direct, not many songs, but it really crystallizes what Sabbath is all about. The doomy, dark, sludgy riffs. Stoner rock came from that album. You wouldn't have Queens of the Stone Age, folks. You wouldn't have a lot of grunge. That's the album. So many great songs on it. The Sweet Leaf, where it starts off with that cough and then it goes into this sludgy, doomy riff. Wonderful. That's the Sabbath I like. I like hearing Sabbath as if they're recording in a dungeon. It's doomy. After Forever, you've summed it up perfectly. The lyrics are challenging. It really it challenges conceptions about people's religion. If you believe in God, should you be looked at and frowned upon? It was really a little bit of Geezer Butler taking on the critics. Geezer Butler is an outstanding lyricist, Reed. I think he's like the Bob Dylan of metal. He doesn't get the kudos that he deserves. And the funny thing is, he's so disarming. He sort of goes, I was so happy that Ronnie James Dio came in and I didn't have to write the lyrics. He kind of, I think, I don't know if it's insecurity or something, but his lyric writing, for most part, is so sharp. And those early albums, maybe, as Bob Daisley says, some things you have to pick up out of necessity. He picked up the role of being the lyricist out of necessity, and he had a great knack for it. The lyrics on this album are so sharp, so socially sharp. Yeah, I just think the whole package of this album, this is the sludge album, this is the fuzz album, this is the album where they just crystallize the Black Sabbath sound, and I love it. So many songs in the package. Into the Void, I'll put another shout out for that, and also the wonderful Children of the Grave, Masters of Reality, Black Sabbath. I really rate it highly.
Okay, here we are, top 3. So this is where I anger everyone in the comments. It's not because I want to anger people, it's just because I have different tastes than you have. Comment section. My number 3 is Born Again. I think, like literally every heavy metal fan in the world, when Ian Gillan joined Black Sabbath, had no idea how that was going to work out. But for the most part, it worked out amazingly. Now, at the time, I was not familiar with Ian's solo catalog. I did not realize that he cannibalized his own lyrics from the Scarabaeus album to include on Born Again. There actually are some phrases, I think, in Disturbing the Priest that he takes off of Scarabaeus and reuses. But no one bought Scarabaeus, so, you know, it's all good. That was from the Ian Gillan Band, which he had before forming Gillan, before joining Black Sabbath. So it was a while back. The sound of the album, again, the production is famously bad, but it is just all part of the package. And I told this story on the Contrarians. I had a friend in high school. He was the only other hardcore heavy metal fan that I knew, and he was a stereophile. He bought stereo equipment. As we're talking about the early 80s or mid 80s here. This was 83, right, that this came out. So he had a tape deck with a very large, powerful amplifier, big speakers. So when I would go over to his house, he would blast this stuff at maximum volume. So when it's got those evil noises, and then it comes in with that Ian Gillan scream, it was a sucker punch. It was like, oh, what in the world is that? It was just this amazing moment that has stuck with me all these years. And it makes the music so much more powerful when you have that kind of visceral reaction to it that probably a lot of people don't get to just, you know, listening to music in their car or streaming Spotify on tiny little desk speakers this big. But man, you crank this album up and Gillan is really going for it. I think he absolutely owns this album. His lyrics are a combination of those weird, irreverent Ian Gillan lyrics along with lyrics that he was trying to tailor for more of a Black Sabbath feel. You have him narrating events that happened during the recording of the album, just like he did with Deep Purple way back in Smoke on the Water. So it's really a mixed package, but the whole thing comes together. Say the only thing that doesn't really work as well for me is Bill Ward's drumming. I think Bill had really checked out. Not that he drums poorly, he just drums very conventionally on this album. I don't think that a lot of the Bill Ward flair is there, but Tony and Ian and Geezer are absolutely into it. I would have liked Geezer to write the lyrics, but Ian wasn't that type of performer. If he was going to be in the band, he was going to write the lyrics. And I can't complain with the end result because I love it so much. It's been a huge part of my life ever since it came out. And I'm a staunch defender of the album.
Do you agree Zero the Hero has probably got one of the most crushing Black Sabbath riffs of all time? Would that be up there?
It's up there, definitely.
Yeah. Look, part of me thinks, like, Ian Gillan famously says when he saw the album cover or he heard the mix, he vomited, and, you know, I'm just wondering secretly if they like the notoriety of the album. Would you agree that this has got a whirlwind of reappraisal? Because just looking on social media and a lot of YouTube shows like this show are talking about this album in 2024.
Right. Well, I think if you Google it, Google now says that, like, you know, 8 out of 10 people like this album. And I'm like, man, that's changed. That certainly wasn't the case back in the day.
Yeah.
You know, my friend with the stereo, he loved it because it pissed his parents off so badly. But I just love the music.
Yeah. Do you remember in the day the Rolling Stone 1 star and the it was really reviled. This was looked at as a flop, but in reality it actually wasn't. So I've got
No,
a
no,
mate
it
of
did
mine
quite
who's
well.
a yeah, I've got a mate of mine who's a mad Deep Purple fan, loves Mark II, loves Ian Gillan, and he never he's never heard this album. So I lent him the CD and he came back and he said, "What the fuck was that?" It's not for everybody. So
No,
if you're used to Ian Gillan and Machine Head and in rock, maybe Born Again is something a little bit different to you. But well done, Reed. You
yeah,
ranked it higher than me, but I have no argument whatsoever. I think it needs to be spoken about, and I'm really looking forward and very curious to see when the remastered version of this comes out, if it comes out. I hope it does. Anyway,
I hope it does too.
yeah. All right. My next pick is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. So I haven't got much more to add than you sort of summed it up perfectly. We have done a show on this. It is the prog album. So many wonderful performances. I'll just add that I think Ozzy's vocals on this album are outstanding. So it's top tier Ozzy in that first part of the Black Sabbath story. Particular shout out to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, the song. There's a particular part of there's some immense rock crunch in that album, and it's got such a doomy riff, but it sort of sticks out with the rest of the album being quite experimental. And I love it when Sabbath or Tony Iommi, I think he's the driving force of that, experiments. If they want to bring in Rick Wakeman, if they want to use strings, if they want to bring in keyboards. It's an album that I play a lot, and I just think that I love it when Sabbath are creative. But a lot of the folk out there, the Sabbath, the diehard Sabbath fans, love those albums that are much more in the doom, the sludge, and the traditional Sabbath sound. So I rank it highly because I just think it's just musically brave, inventive, creative, and there's just so many wonderful bits and pieces. Yeah, look, you summed it up perfectly. I haven't got much more to say. Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I'd rank that quite high. All right, Reed, what's your next one?
Okay, we're down to the last two. So, anybody who has seen me on other shows, this will probably come as no surprise, but I am going to put Heaven and Hell at my number two. So, I agree with you that there's something not quite right about the production to this. I think the production is not as heavy as the material. It needs, I mean, I'm not a producer. I don't know what it needs. More bottom end. It needs something. But the material is wonderful. I often say this was a transition album in its purest form. If you watch the Dio documentary movie, was it Dreamers Never Die? Wendy says that Ronnie actually didn't like Black Sabbath's music and he wasn't sure he wanted to join the band. And the Dio that sings on Heaven and Hell is very much still the Dio from Rainbow. He's the balladeer Dio. He's the Dio singing. You can see him standing back with the microphone. And it's a transitional album. He wasn't completely on board, but he's still writing these lyrics. Most of these songs would have fit in fine on Rainbow Rising. Something like Neon Nights would have fit in fine on Long Live Rock and Roll. So he's got one foot in Sabbath and one foot in Rainbow still. I will say this album, Heaven and Hell, I think is Geezer Butler's shining moment. His bass is very high in the mix. He's very far forward. I presume that was Tony Martin's choice. Although I know in some albums, Geezer has said, look, some of the other guys were a little out of it, and I was there to help with the mixing process. So maybe he asked to be a little bit more forward, but you can really hear his bass playing on the album, and it is just off the charts. Geezer is absolutely one of the finest rock bassists ever. And this is the album that he really owns. Now, again, I think Bill Ward puts in a very pedestrian drum performance. If you play it back to back with Master of Reality, in Master of Reality, he's just crazy. he's like in Keith Moon mode. He's all over the place. He's throwing out notes and hitting instruments. And in this, he's putting out a very competent rock and roll sort of drum performance, but it's just not the equal of that. But for me, it's about Dio's voice. It's about the new lyrical direction. You still get some great riffs from Tony, and it's Geezer's bass, and that whole package is so good. And let's not forget that this is the template that every Dio album would follow for the rest of his career, where you have the fast opener and then the big like epic track with the slow start, and then you know have a couple of heavy midterm tracks. It was nearly a perfect album, but it's still my number 2.
Nice. Just a few more things that I just want to mention. Geezer Butler's bass playing. I've seen him live in Sabbath, and one person really aptly described his bass playing on stage as wrestling a snake. He's bubbly bass player, and on that album, his bass lines are just sublime. Bill Ward. Bill Ward was going through some major problems. I think he was in between an alcoholic rehabilitation clinic or not. And he often said that he felt lost without Ozzy. And I'm just wondering if that, his performance or the lack of inventiveness that you've referred to on Born Again and also on Heaven and Hell is because he's missing Ozzy. That emotional attachment. Once Ozzy's in the band and you've got the band of brothers, he's back to the Bill that we know. So I'm just wondering if that's part of it. And just recapturing about the producer Martin Birch, it is a bit of a head scratch about the production on that album. And you compare it to Mob Rules, it's like night and day. Anyway. All right, thanks, Reed. My number 2. Number 2 and number 1, I was oscillating. Very much a fraction between both. I love them dearly, but I've come to a decision, and my number 2 is Paranoid. So I think this is the benchmark album. This is the album that everybody gravitates to. I haven't looked at the charts or the sales of Black Sabbath per se, but I would imagine it'd be right up there because it's got all the blue chip Black Sabbath songs. Paranoid, War Pigs, Iron Man, Fairies Wear Boots. It's all there. They're starting to lose their blues influence off the self-titled debut. It's still there. You've still got the wonderfully acute Aussie vocal lines. I was listening to this day. I was in the house by myself and just pumping it up. And Ozzy's vocals are very fragile in some bits. You can hear the cracking of his voice. And I love that. It shows a little bit of fragility. But it's still tuneful at the same time. He is such a unique vocalist, Ozzy. And comparing his vocal stylings, the young Ozzy to the most, the more processed Ozzy, and I'm talking about way deep into his career, solo career, is like night and day. I love this album. It defines everything that is Sabbath. It's sludgy, it's doomy. It's got some wonderful riffs. I wouldn't say it's terribly complicated. I think Iommi during the career was figuring it out in regards to his technique as a guitarist, but it's still wonderfully influential. Paranoid's an interesting one, Reed. I think that's also borderline garage punk. There's a bit of punk in it. I don't think it's necessarily a metal song. And there's a lot of songs in this album that you could not necessarily say that it's metal. You could say it's garage. You could say it's stoner. There's a lot of different genres. And that's why I think this album is so wonderful, because it's kind of a cross-genre band. They were a cross-genre band, and it's a cross-genre music that they're pushing out comparative to their 80s material. Anyway, Black Sabbath Paranoid, it's got all the hits. It's got all the Black Sabbath staples that you would expect, and that's my number 2.
Okay. I had a feeling that would rank highly. All right, so again, for anybody who's heard me go on and on and on about Ronnie James Dio, it will come as no surprise that Dio has my favorite Black Sabbath album, literally the song that turned me into a heavy metal fan for life was Mob Rules. Off of the album, my number one favorite pick from Black Sabbath, Mob Rules. Remember, the song is the Mob Rules. The album is just Mob Rules. I do think the production on it is crushingly heavy. And on this album, I think Tony Iommi listened to Heaven and Hell and went, it's not heavy enough and there's too much Geezer. So Geezer is pushed back. He gets a couple of really good feature spots, like on Slippin' Away. But the guitar is way forward and the vocals are way forward. And this album is where Tony and Ronnie really mesh together. Ronnie has lost all of his reservations about being part of this band. You can tell he is 100% on board. He's no longer standing back with the microphone. You can just picture him like right up in the audience's face, right? Making the horns, and he was into it. Even songs like, I think Country Girl, some people give some flack because it's a love song. And I'm like, kids, this has to be the heaviest love song ever recorded, or at least in the mix, you know, up for consideration for that title. It's got a fantastic riff. One of my all-time favorite Black Sabbath songs is Voodoo. Again, fantastic guitar line, and it's completely naked at the beginning. No drums, no bass, no vocals, just Tony's guitar at the beginning. So that's why I say I think Tony was like, there wasn't enough Tony on Heaven and Hell, so we're going to put me right up front. And it's just for me where all of it comes together. And I really, in a way, I consider 70s Black Sabbath, even though they created, I agree with Martin Popoff that Black Sabbath created heavy metal, but they viewed themselves as a rock band, and with hindsight, their 70s albums are rock albums, albeit some of the heaviest rock albums ever put out. But by the time you hit Mob Rules, they are a heavy metal band. Mob Rules is heavy metal. Born Again is heavy metal. Eternal Idol is heavy metal. They're just a metal band from here forward. And I think this is really the album where all of that came together.
Well, thank you, Reed. And yeah, I think that I think you're right. I think Tony definitely tapped Martin Birch on the shoulder and said, less Geezer, more Tony. My number one, Sabotage. So I did a show with Peter Jones last year, and I said, is this probably the greatest heavy metal or hard, I think I said hard rock album of all time? It's right up there. I love it. You eloquently said that it's probably got Ozzy's best vocals. I agree. I think there was a lot of pain in the band because they were realizing that their manager had ripped them off, and there was legal things flying left, right, and center. And that had a really sort of negative effect on the band. And a lot of the venom, a lot of the anger is coming out in the playing and the lyrics. And out of great pain comes great art. And this is great art. I'm going to start my little spiel with talking about Superstar. That is one scary piece of music. I described it as the army of Satan coming in. I love that. And it seems to be a common sort of theme music that when Black Sabbath play live, they play that little snippet with the choirs. So right. I love that bit of music. I just want to put a little bit of spotlight before I go into the other tracks. Hole in the Sky. That's just wonderful, crushing riff. And the lyrics are just, you know, it sort of challenges people's perception, religion, life, the universe. I think it's great. Geezer's most incisive lyrics are in this album, in my opinion. Sabotage. Symptoms of the Universe. Am I Going Insane? The Writ. It doesn't outstay its welcome. 40 minutes, which is the right length for a hard rock and metal album. It's got a daffy album cover, Reed. Gets knocked, but I don't mind it. It's just them in their 70s garb. It's no worse than what Rush were in the 70s. And a lot of bands for that. You know, who doesn't like wearing a Commono on an album cover? Maybe it doesn't fit the music, which is just crushingly heavy. Anyway, I think this is Black Sabbath firing on all cylinders. And they were basically, you know, it was a band. They were bunching together. There was a lot of adversity that was in their corner, and they just come out firing, and it's just really angry. And this is the Black Sabbath that I like. Dark, dingy, angry, sludgy. So there you have it, Sabotage. Well, there you go, Reed. We did 10 to 1. Very briefly, and I'm going to put you on the spot because that's what I like doing, putting you on the spot. The most overrated Black Sabbath album.
Ooh, overrated. Well, I have to put that is a tough one. But kind of by definition, because everybody rates it so highly, I put Volume 4 as their most overrated album. And I think it's a great album. There's a lot of people that are like, oh, Volume 4 is the best album they ever did. And I think there's some real weaknesses on that album. So I'm not really, I don't hold it in as high esteem, I think, as a lot of the Sabbath community. Although I do enjoy it and I listen to it a lot. It's one of my top 10 albums, but I think it's overrated.
I agree. I was going to say Volume 4 to me is a bit overrated, and I don't sort of gravitate to those songs as much as the other in the catalogue. And I know that that is a very much a druggy album. There's so many references on it, and yeah, it doesn't resonate with me as highly. But I was going to pick that one. Alrighty. Well, thank you, Reed. You can see Reed Little on the Contrarians. Just type in the word Reed Little. You'll see hundreds of clips, and you'll actually see hundreds of clips on this channel, Rock Daydream Nation. So please tell us what your favorite Black Sabbath album, your least favorite. Tell us what you think of our picks. Agree, disagree. Like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Click on the bell. Your support helps this channel. And plenty more shows are going to be in this Black Sabbath hard rock wheelhouse. So thank you, Reed, once more. One thing's for sure, you'll see Reed Little and me doing another show on Rock Daydream Nation. Stay tuned. I'll see you later. Cheers.
Bye. Thanks, Peter.